Climate change is getting worse, and some of the damage is irreversible. A UN panel's latest assessment follows decades of dire warnings. But are people listening? And how do we combat so-called climate fatigue and ensure action? This is Inside Story. Hi there, welcome to the programme. I'm Kim Vanel. A code red for humanity, a wake-up call for the world. That's just some of the latest reactions to the biggest UN review of our warming planet since 2013. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says there's no longer any doubt that humans are heating up the oceans, land and sea by burning fossil fuels. Some of the damage, such as melting polar ice sheets, are now irreversible. Wildfires, heat waves and floods will likely become even more extreme, even if we drastically cut greenhouse gas emissions.
You've been telling us for over 3 decades of the dangers of allowing the planet to warm. The world listened, but didn't hear. The world listened, but it did not act strongly enough. And as a result, climate change is a problem that is here now. Nobody's safe, and it's getting worse faster.
The report comes at a crucial time and ahead of a major UN climate summit in Glasgow in November. US Secretary of State Anthony Blinken says governments and the private sector must work together with urgency to protect our planet. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, whose government is hosting the summit, says the report makes for sobering reading. India described it as a clarion call for developed nations. It's urging them to take immediate steps toward reducing carbon emissions. The European Union struck a more hopeful note. Its deputy climate chief said the report shows it's not too late to turn the tide. Well, the president of the COP26 summit in November says despite the dire predictions, we still have time to limit the damage.
There is one other sort of key message to take away from this, which is that the future, of course, is not yet written. The very worst of climate change is still avoidable. And if we look back to Paris in 2015, world leaders got together and said that they would do everything they could to limit global temperature rises to well below 2 degrees and aiming for 1.5. And what this report shows that 1.5 degrees is still achievable, but that it is retreating and is retreating fast.
All right, let's bring in our guests. In Reading, in the UK, we have Richard Allen, Professor of Climate Science at the University of Reading and one of the authors of the IPCC report. In Melbourne, we have Grant Blaschke, an Associate Professor at the Nossal Institute for Global Health at the University of Melbourne and the author of Climate Health and Courage. And in London, Tom Burke, Chairman of E3G, Third Generation Environmentalism Think Tank. A very warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us here on Inside Story. I'd like to begin with you, Mr. Allen, so that we lay out what's at stake before we get into this conversation. If the world continues on its current trajectory, the report finds that the world could warm by 2 degrees by the year 2060. What will or would that world look like?
Well, the science assessed in this report is pretty clear that we're already seeing extreme rain, extreme heat intensifying, and that's just at 1 degree C above pre-industrial. So a 2 degrees C or higher, more warm world than that is going to intensify these extremes even more. And as has already been shown in your report and stated in your report, there's still time to avoid the worst dangers of climate change if we act now.
All right, Mr. Tom Burke, why have we been so unable to change the course of the climate crisis so far? I mean, we have been talking about this for years.
Yeah, you're right about that. And it's not because the scientists haven't been telling us that we should pay attention. The military has been telling us since the end of the last century we needed to pay attention. The public has now really got very anxious as the experience they're having of fires and floods has validated their view of the science, but the people who are not listening are the politicians. We know what we need to do in order to avoid the worst kind of effects of climate change. And we know we can afford to do it. What we need now is for the politicians to step up to the plate and do and adopt the policies that we need to make what's possible real.
Mr. Blaschke, you know, when you talk about this, we talk about wildfires becoming more common, heat waves, floods, everything we're seeing at the moment is just going to get worse. Is there climate anxiety? I'm wondering, particularly among young people who've grown up with this information, and what does that look like?
Yeah, well, what we've seen is really a triple whammy at the moment, where we've got this IPCC report, and the experts are saying CO2 as high as it's been in 2 million years. At the same time, the facts on the ground in the Northern Hemisphere, you know, Greece, Turkey burning, and here in Australia, we saw all this with our very hot heatwave summer at the end of 2019. And I think the third thing that's really driving this is the backdrop of the pandemic. And it's been a big wake-up call, I think, to humanity that we're not as in charge as we thought we were. So all these things have come together. And in a way, once the penny drops for people that, hey, this climate change thing is serious and it's happening now, you can't unsee it. And it creates a lot of stress and anxiety, especially for young people, as you say.
Are you seeing that in your clinical practice?
Absolutely. We're having a lot of young people who, amongst, you know, the stress of lockdowns and quarantines and things around COVID, are now seeing a lot of media, particularly today, around climate change. And, you know, they're very concerned about the future. And I spend quite a lot of time with them talking about the Hope budget and saying it is a scary time, but you know what, we're going to need a lot of young, smart, brilliant people to do well at school, do well at uni, and be part of finding the solutions and working on this urgent transformation that we need.
Mr. Tom Burke, on the other side, maybe not so much in the younger generation, but on the other side, are we seeing people with climate fatigue, people not caring so much because it doesn't feel like it's impacting them immediately?
No, I don't think we're seeing that. I don't think there really isn't a problem with the public, whether they're old or young. Polling all over the world shows a rising level of anxiety, as Grant was describing. But what we're seeing are the incumbents, the people who have really entrenched interests in the current energy system, digging in very deeply and resisting change. And so that's why I put the emphasis on the politicians, because in a sense, the public needs the politicians to protect them from the efforts of the incumbents to stop us changing our energy system.
Okay, I want to park that and come back to how we get policy change in a minute, but I'd like to come back to you, Mr. Allen. The report says that humans are unequivocally to blame for what we're seeing, but does encouraging people to get engaged in climate change on an individual level, will that make enough of a difference, or does it need to be stopping those big emitters at the top? Does it need to be only policy down, if you know what I'm saying?
Well, yeah, absolutely. Good point. So in terms of individuals, sure, people can see what's going on in terms of the climate change and see the science, and they can take various actions themselves. But if everyone does a little bit, unfortunately, we'll achieve only a little bit. So everyone needs to do a lot. And the only way that can happen is for governments, for cities, for companies to take leadership and cause large-scale and rapid reduction in carbon dioxide emissions.
Mr. Burke, we should talk about opportunities to address climate change. What are some of the most obvious opportunities that are out there right now in terms of building for a better future? I'm thinking about smarter ways of building and smarter ways of living.
Well, you're absolutely right to pick on smarter ways of building. The most rapid way and the cheapest way and the most dramatic way we can reduce emissions is to reduce the carbon associated with heating and cooling our buildings. And that's the first thing, and that should take priority. But after that, the things we need to do are to change the power system, basically to stop burning fossil fuels to make electricity and use the renewables and the increasing technology on storage that's available to make electricity without carbon. And then we need to get rid of, very importantly next, to get rid of the use of fossil fuels for mobility. So that means first and foremost electric vehicles for cars, for light transport. But then as we go further down the pike, we need to invest enormously in getting carbon out of shipping and getting carbon out of aviation. But right now, the best thing to do in transport is to accelerate the deployment of vehicles. So those are the priorities for getting forward. Now, there are some other things we need to do that are going to be more difficult, but we need to buy time now so that we get the easy things to do done very, very rapidly indeed.
Some of those things, I mean, they seem from the outset, just hearing about them, like quite radical shifts. I want to come back to you, Mr. Blaschke. I want to talk about the idea of collective efficacy, the idea that if we all believe that we can make a change, then and if there's a societal shift toward making a change, that we can all be effective together. Because it's very interesting when you look at what's happening with the pandemic. You know, we all know we need to end the virus. We all know we need to get vaccines across the world in an equal way, and yet we can't seem to do it. So what hope is there for us being able to band together to make an impact on climate change?
Well, it's really interesting. There's a brand new study out in Australia by Rebecca Patrick and colleagues, over 5,000 Australians. And they found that Australians were 3 times more worried about climate change than COVID at the moment, which is really interesting. And that's what we're seeing, that yes, this acute crisis of COVID has happened, but in the background, particularly because we experienced, you know, these huge fires in the end of 2019, I think that there's a real collective will to do something. And so definitely that collective way of approaching things is going to be absolutely essential. I also think, you know, for viewers, they should never feel like they have to or can do everything on their own. So banding together with like-minded people is really essential, and it's going to be part of the transformation that we need to make.
Mr. Allen, I want to come back to the science for a minute, because some of the impacts of climate change, no matter what we do from here on out, they're irreversible, aren't they?
Well, that's right. So it takes hundreds of years for the deep ocean to fully heat up. And it takes many hundreds of years for the giant ice sheets to melt and come to their new equilibrium in a new warmer world. So sea level rise is one example of an irreversible change. So we're already committed to maybe a few meters of sea level rise, but that's over many, many hundreds of years. So that's, in many regions, you can adapt to that kind of change, and it's beyond human timescales. But the crucial thing to note is that if we don't limit the warming of the planet to 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial, or even 2 degrees C if 1.5 isn't possible, then there'll be an even larger rise in sea level in the long term. So the fact that it's irreversible still doesn't mean we don't need to stop doing cutting greenhouse gas emissions. It's even more crucial to do that.
I want to pause for a minute there and take a look at who some of the worst emitters are around the world. Topping the list is China, estimated to produce 30% of all global emissions. That's followed by the United States, which is producing nearly 15% of our total carbon footprint. And also at the top of the list are India, Russia, and Japan. Mr. Burke, I want to talk about that with you first. China's per person emissions are about half of that of the US, but because of its massive population, it's far and above the largest emitter. It's been criticized for its tepid response to addressing climate change. What's your take?
I think that China has a very big problem, as do India, Russia, and all the other countries. And in a way, trying to sort this out in terms of per capita emissions is not a problem. Carbon is fungible. Wherever a carbon atom is emitted in the world, it's actually going to have an effect on everyone else in the world. And so we can't try to get this into some sort of argument. We're not going to get far if it's you've got to do more because you're creating more of the problem. We have a collective problem and we have to solve it together. We're all, if climate policy fails, we all lose.
But isn't that exactly what's happening among countries? I mean, you have India calling this report a clarion call for developed nations, but it itself has not committed to carbon neutrality even by 2060, like China. So isn't there a bit of hypocrisy happening at the policy level?
Oh, there's hypocrisy happening everywhere. But I agree with you. I don't think the Indian government is helping its own people or the rest of us by turning this into a blame game. We're not going to get anywhere if nobody will act until everybody else is acting. So we really do. It's why I say this is a problem for the politicians to sort out. And it's a problem where politicians have to give a lead. And you're not giving a lead when you're trying to blame somebody else for the problem. And so much as I understand why people think it's very unfair, that some people have created more of the problem than other people, I simply don't think we're going to get very far if the discussion is about who has to act first before anybody else acts.
Sure.
And anyway, by the way, in terms of those big countries, the people who are going to suffer most are actually all the small countries in the rest of the world, in Africa, in Oceania, in those parts of the world, in the Caribbean, especially those small island states. They're the people who are going to suffer more. And by the way, they're not the people who are issuing these blame calls for everybody else.
Mr. Blaschke, what is the most constructive way to talk about climate change, the climate threat, the impacts of climate change that we're hearing right now? What is the most constructive way to talk about that in order to encourage change and action?
It's a really important question because I think young people and many of us have got a lot on our plate at the moment. So as I said, we need to keep up the hope budget. And I don't mean Pollyanna hope, like magical thinking that's just going to get better, but like a mature, grounded hope that we need urgent action, we need serious leadership, and really need to get behind our leaders before Glasgow so that we have these ambitious emission targets. It's an enormous challenge for humanity. For the individuals, I think, don't think in terms of all or nothing. 2 degrees rise is going to be a lot less worse than 4 degrees rise. So every bit of effort that we're making is worthwhile. Action's a great stress reliever, and you can pressure businesses through your purchases, pressure politicians through your voting. And I should also say, if you're feeling a bit overwhelmed by it all, there's a lot going on in the world, step back for a while, have a bit of a break, or if you're finding yourself very unsettled, seek some professional assistance and make sure that you're looking after yourself.
Sure. Mr. Burke, if the population, the global population, is as engaged on climate change as you say, why is that not translating into action at the policy level? Is there a disconnect?
I think there certainly is a disconnect. I think that the politicians, by and large, are more subject to pressure from the incumbent entrenched interests than they are for their own populations. And it's interesting, something that Grant said earlier matters here, in the sense that people, when they can, do things together in communities, are really willing to do that, as he pointed out. And that says there's a really important role for the mayors, the leaders of cities, to fill some of the gap in translating into problems into solutions, into action, fill some of the gap that's being left by the politicians at a national level. So I think we don't want to only look at what's going on at the national level. We need to look at what's going on in all those cities and towns where there are loads of examples of people coming together with local leadership and really getting on with solving the problems.
Mr. Allen, how quickly will our world respond to action, to a reduction in fossil fuels? Talk us through a little bit about what hope there is if we can come together and take action.
Yeah, it won't happen immediately. It'll take decades for the climate to stabilize once action is taken. So it'll take a while before we can even notice the effects, but we've got to take the action as rapidly and as strongly as we can do so now. And that's why I would just like to add that, I mean, this assessment report from the IPCC is extremely important because it's assessed all the science over 3 years. But in the final stages, the summary is for policymakers, and that has been agreed line by line, word by word, by 195 countries' delegates who were involved in the approval process. So they've approved what is said in this report, so they know what the options are. And so the report like this can act as a tool, a resource to lead into the COP26 in Glasgow in the UK upcoming in November. So it's really crucial that they appreciate that this has been agreed and collaborated with governments, and now it's up to governments to take the strong action, and as the other guests have mentioned, up to cities, companies, and getting into collectives. So we can all do a bit, but the government action is absolutely crucial.
Very quickly, well, I guess it's actually quite a big question, but I want to ask about climate denial on the from a psychology point of view in a little bit. But for you, Mr. Allen, explain to me how the science has improved in terms of being able to project forward and to actually unequivocally link weather events with climate change, because that has been a bastion for climate deniers for quite a while. But the science has really improved, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has. So we've got better and longer observation records, better satellite data, and that's already showing an increase in a number of extremes, intense rainfall, heat waves. But as you mentioned, it also involves physical understanding of the processes that's getting stronger, but also really high, fine detail computer simulations that simulate all the weather patterns that could be created in a particular event. And so scientists are able now to actually use this as a laboratory where they can run hundreds of simulations with or without the warming that we've seen to date, and show that these events that are happening around the world already, the heavy rain in Iran, for example, in China, in Europe, the heat waves, we can show now that they've been made more severe by the warming due to greenhouse gas emissions, and that some events would not have happened, would have been almost impossible to happen in a world without this warming. So there's that, and these same models, these same simulations are then used to project out into the future. And they're not perfect, but they're packed with the best physics that we can pack into them. And that's why we're more sure now of the regional impacts, the regional changes in climate that we can expect as we continue to emit, or we don't continue to emit, carbon dioxide.
Even so, incredibly, there are still climate deniers out there. Mr. Blaschke, I mean, there are some quite well-known, famous people who fall into that camp, but how does that happen? I mean, is there a real cognitive dissonance going on there?
Well, you're right there. And there are actually less climate deniers than you think. They're often a very noisy minority. In Australia, we know 87 to 88% of people accept all the science and accept it as driven by human behaviour. 97% of the scientists at least have a consensus that human-induced climate change is happening. So it's a small number. Different reasons why people get into that. Some get caught in a bit of an echo chamber on the internet of misinformation and myths. Some find that it's really conflicts with their worldview or their politics or their understanding of the world. And I guess others perhaps are just a bit mischievous and are happy to take a contrary view. But the important thing is that we're seeing in the world with the facts on the ground now, not even just models.
Yeah.
It's becoming more and more impossible to deny the reality of climate change.
We are coming to the end of the programme. Very quickly, Mr. Burke, I want to ask you, we've got about a minute to go. How hopeful are you for the future of our planet, for the belief that we can make a change and we can confront this threat?
What we've seen all over the world from the coronavirus is that actually, by and large, people, wherever their culture, are willing to do the right thing when it's clearly explained to them what needs to be done. That's what gives me hope that we can deal with this problem. But to do that, we need politicians to give a much better lead than they're giving at the moment.
All right. Hey, thank you very much for joining us here on Inside Story. Richard Allen, Grant Blaschke and Tom Burke. We appreciate it.